Hello, and welcome to the Change My View podcast. This is episode 17 on March 11th. And today we are joined by Alex Frankel, who is about to introduce himself just now. So, Alex, please give a quick introduction.
As Cal said, my name's Alex Frankel. I'm a master's student at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. I'm getting a degree in interaction design. And the reason I'm here today is because I'm working on a thesis called What Are They Thinking? Which is a tool to help people figure out perspective or learn the perspective of people whose perspective they don't share. That was a pretty weak introduction. But basically, it's a resource for people to get a better understanding of perspective on issues that they don't have.
Yeah, and that has a lot of alignment with Change My View, which you came across and you got in contact with. So it's been really great talking with you recently about your project. How long have you been working on this project?
I've been working on it since September, so it's been about 7 months. And I only found out about Change My View in like the last month, maybe. So that was a real eye-opener to see a group of people that had figured out a system to have civil discourse, which is something that I think I've been trying to find and doing a lot of research on, like the science behind civil discourse and all that sort of thing. So seeing Change My View and seeing the popularity of Change My View was really sort of inspiring.
Yeah. And so when you started this project, had it been something, these problems you were talking about, something in your mind for a while, and you had this idea to try and address them, as opposed to just a project for your degree? It's actually something you're believing in.
Yeah, good question. So I had become sort of politically engaged maybe a year or 2 years before this most recent election in 2016, and was still trying to figure out like what my political ideology was, or what I was interested in, or whatever. And then seeing both the Democratic primary and then eventually the general election really made me want to understand like how people form their ideologies, how do people assess who they want to vote for, how they perceive issues, all that sort of thing. And I just kept seeing what seemed to me to be so many sort of like bad examples of the media or the mainstream media trying to explain people's viewpoints. And I thought that there had to be a better way to sort of seek that information out quickly, because when I tried to figure that out, of like, why did Trump voters vote for Trump, or why did Bernie voters vote for Bernie, or whatever it was, it's really hard, and there's so many different opinions, and so you can get a really warped view of why people made a decision if you don't have the right resources. So I wanted to see if there was a way to have a better way to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned your kind of realization of your political beliefs, etc., because as someone who created Change My View, I similarly didn't really have any kind of political engagement when I was leading up to it. In fact, I was completely unpolitical. And although in many ways Change My View isn't a political subreddit, so it's not exactly necessary, but I've kind of come into the whole political arena through this experience myself. Would you say that this project has, given you some lessons or changed some of your views in the process? Have you had to really do some introspection throughout? And
definitely,
yeah.
Like I did a lot of reading about what it means to have. All of this is in the context of political, but I think it applies sort of everywhere. But what does it mean to form your political ideology? And really early on, I read this book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, who is controversial. Like, some people really disagree with how he sees the world, but it gave me sort of more vocabulary for this sort of space. So I think that I learned a lot about how how people process information. So for example, like why does someone become a liberal versus conservative? It depends on so many factors of how they were disciplined as a child and all these other things that sort of prepare you for how you're going to take on new experiences. And so all those sorts of things sort of help me understand the space better, I guess. That's the question.
I'm about halfway through that book just now as well, so that's kind of interesting to me. I'm trying to get through it at the moment, and yeah, it's a really good book so far as I can see. And it just relevant to everything we're doing, and
exactly,
particularly his elephant and the rider analogy. That's where I'm at the moment.
Literally, I mean, after I finished reading that book and started incorporating that stuff into my thesis, I changed the title of my thesis blog to Elephants and Asteroids, and so he has this other thing called the Asteroid Project, which is really interesting. I'm sure people who listen to this would be interested in it, but basically, his argument is that if there was a giant asteroid coming in and about to hit planet Earth, we'd all sort of band together to solve that problem for the sake of our own existence. And so he says there are conservative asteroids and liberal asteroids. So the liberal asteroid is global warming. So most liberals see that as sort of an existential threat. And then on the other side, conservatives see the national debt, at least up until recently, in America as a existential threat. And so the goal of the asteroid game is what he calls it, is can you get people from the opposite political perspective to solve the other person's issue? So can you get conservatives to solve global warming, and can you get liberals to solve the national debt? And so all that sort of stuff was really interesting too.
Nice. And sorry, I haven't.
This is Michael Hatch here. You'll be hearing a little bit less of me today. My internet's not so great today for some reason. But Alex, I just wanted to ask, in engaging in a academic as you are, and is there any new vocabulary that you've taken on that would be useful to our audience in terms of the area using layperson words or slang for, but that you now maybe have some useful formal terms for that you're working with?
That's a very good question. I think the biggest one for me is, it's not like an academic term, ideology. I know you care a lot about like definitions. Like the definition of ideology is not clear, and the definition of what a conservative is not necessarily clear, or a liberal is not necessarily clear. So I think unpacking the layers as part of this academic process of what does it mean to have a particular ideology has been something that I've learned a lot about, and like particularly around like how you grew up and what generation you were a part of. So the recent example is if you were a millennial and trying to find a job right after the financial crisis, that is an event that really shaped your worldview and will probably continue to shape your worldview for the next couple decades or for the rest of your life. So it doesn't really answer your question exactly as you phrase it, but that process of getting deeper into some of those definitions was really good.
Gotcha. Cool.
And speaking of ideologies, etc., in your experience, do you think we jump too quickly into trying to label ourselves and put ourselves into these boxes and teams? And do you think there is some disadvantages to that we should perhaps look at more as a society?
Yeah, there's a lot of research around tribalism that Jonathan Haidt covers. Amy Chua just released a book, I think it's called Political Tribe. She's on like a speaking tour about it.
I've heard her on a couple of different podcasts.
Yeah, and she talks, and Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about these political camps, and it becomes your sort of political team, which can be good if you need to sort of get your team together to do something that might otherwise have been harder to do if you were all sort of separate factions. But there's also the bad side of it, where you get stuck with perspectives that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have, but because of sort of political machines, you either sort of just accept that as that's what my party thinks or my ideology thinks, or you really do sort of get kind of a warped view of what's really going on.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned to me before privately that you have faced some of these issues with regards to your project that you're working on, where the whole idea is that you've got pages for what do such and such think about such and such, and the ideology is very much in your face at the start. And have you had any progression on that since our conversation? Or
I think so. You had even mentioned like putting the ideology farther down the page, so it's not the first thing, because it does prime you in a way to say like, okay, I'm expecting to see a certain thing, which again has pros and cons. I think what I might do going forward is not introduce it right away with ideology, but have that sort of be the subtitle of the page. So here's what Alex thinks about Wall Street reform, and then right below it might say Alex is blah blah blah, or sees himself as blah blah blah, which I think will be better, but it remains to be seen.
Interesting. I guess that's what this project's all about for you as well, is maybe figuring out those things and what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, the whole thing has been, just like Change My View, just a lot of iteration. I started out my year wanting to create like an alternative conservative news network of some kind, and that somehow found its way to where I am now. So it's been a lot of change.
Nice.
And would that sort of overlap with what I've been hearing called like the not the dark web, but like the dark media, or this like there's a constellation of some people I'm seeing now that aren't like your Rubin and Sam Harris and Joe Rogan to a degree, and some others that are sort of not standard liberal or conservative, but are sort of more, I don't know, there's a new vein, I think, coming through, and you're talking about an alternate conservatism, and I'm wondering if you're kind of going in that direction or something different.
I think that what we're seeing a lot now, like post 2016 and all this talk from mainstream media, is like people were frustrated at the current state of how they consume information. That's the reason why something like Fox News was able to get created in the first place. And I think people feel that now, in that like if you're just watching Fox News and MSNBC, you're getting a completely warped worldview, from my opinion, of what people actually think. And in order to really get deeper into how any given person perceives any given issue, you have to do a ton of work to peel back the layers. I think something like Change My View peels back those layers really quickly, and maybe that's why it's so good. Is like I can post something that I think I believe, and then the whole CMV community is going to sort of pick that apart in the most positive possible way. They're trying to get to a good answer. And I think I've said to both you and Cal, that I think what my goal is to turn a Change My View post into a concise article. And I haven't figured out how to do that, or the right way to do that, but that is really, I think, at a high level what my intention is with this project.
Yeah, and you call this project an anti-encyclopedia of sorts, don't you? Of argument, yeah. Kind of like a database of arguments.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not when I said encyclopedia to people for the first time, they said, well, that makes me think that there's one right answer. So the reason it's anti-encyclopedia is that it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. Because even if someone settled on, this is my perspective today, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow that will sort of shake up that person's worldview. So everything is really dynamic and up for debate.
Now, I notice sometimes that a lot of, and this is maybe a bit anecdotal, but of regular folks you run into do often trend towards the middle more than the people you hear, where the people you hear are more on the ends of things. So when you're sort of pulling together this constellation that serves as the archetype of a certain point of view, let's say, what do conservatives think about gun control, that sort of thing, how do you balance out sort of what you hear more of versus what more people actually think? Like, cause sometimes what you hear is not often the more common. Like, how do you build up the cliche or the trope of what the standard thing is, but keeping in mind what the common quiet view is that you don't hear, that oftentimes I find it's more towards the middle.
I think giving people a platform to get out their relatively more moderate perspectives, and moderate is like, it's a loaded term as well, but the reason Change My View, in my opinion, is getting popular is because it incentivizes positive discussion of non-mainstream ideas. And like cable news, what they see as mainstream is whatever gets the most views or the most clicks or whatever. It's not the mainstream argument. It's the most popular in terms of getting people to watch argument. So I think one thing I need to do, and one thing I realize a lot more, is I need to figure out what the system is to promote positive, less popular sort of points of view, like exactly what the Delta system does, which is encourage better discussion of things that are not as like clickbaity or whatever it is. I need to figure out how that would work for what are they thinking.
Yeah, because I've said a few times now that, you know, echo chambers are money makers, and the idea that these kind of exposing yourself to things you might not like to hear, how that could be popular in any way is kind of surprising. I mean, to some extent, Change My View is surprising in that regard, because people are literally, you know, they're putting themselves in a very vulnerable position, something that people really don't like to do a lot of the time. And but you know, people are doing it daily on the subreddit, so you know, there's obviously a need for it somewhere.
Yeah, I really
underline.
Go ahead.
Sorry, can I just underline how I still am blown away in Black every day of new people changing their minds, like in public. it's just yeah. Anyway, sorry.
It's amazing. I mean, when you think about it, like, can you imagine like those MSNBC or whatever cable news panels where they have like 75 talking heads on TV at the same time? Can you imagine if they all said to each other, like, you know what, you're right, you're right, you're right. Like, never in a million years is that going to happen. So how can we ever expect, if that's how people are consuming information, that that's how they get to like a better place of understanding? And by the way, I don't think it's just cable. I think newspapers, I think the New York Times is dealing with this just as much. I mean, they're trying to sort of figure it out, and with their like op-ed section, they're stirring up a lot of controversy with people like Brett Stevens and Barry Weiss and people like that. So they're wrestling with how do we show people more perspectives, and they're I think in good faith trying to figure it out, but it's a hard thing to do because you do need to sell papers and you do need to sell subscriptions. So it's really hard to strike that balance between needing to be popular and wanting to deliver the best information.
Yeah, because we have that problem sometimes as well, with this idea that by allowing discussion of certain topics, we are promoting those topics, which I disagree with that conclusion totally. Because, as a quick summary, if we are allowing a view to be discussed, we are also allowing every single top level comment in response to be criticizing that view quite severely. So which are we promoting? Are we promoting the view or the criticism? You know, it's that's always our go-to defense in that case as well. But also another defense is that it works. The subreddit often changes these views. But yeah, it's a really interesting dilemma that I think a lot of media outlets are facing at the moment, as you mentioned. And so to go back to your project, what is your kind of vision for how it's going to go forward, and maybe the end goal, and what you'd like to do from here on out?
I think that my goal for the end of the year, so when my thesis is done, is hopefully I've figured out a way to sort of do this. So I've had a bunch of different suggestions about how to go about this. So I think what I'm going to do going forward is try and see if it can work for one particular topic. So one that I think in my circles I can get some traction on and get people to contribute to is like perspective on what is the future of the Democratic Party. So here in New York City, that's a topic of hot discussion. Like, do we go more towards like the Bernie Sanders camp, or do we go more towards the Hillary Clinton centrist camp? And so that, I think something like that, to see if something like that can work, and use that as a beta test of what the rules should be, what the rewards should be, that sort of thing. If I can get one of those sort of cases to work, that'll give me confidence to sort of open it up to all sorts of topics, all sorts of perspectives. So fingers crossed. Great.
Yeah. So how are we doing for time here, Michael? What do you think?
So I think we're about 25 minutes in roughly. I didn't make a proper mark. But
so if you could just
more in terms of for those who aren't familiar with how a master's project works or the process works, administratively speaking, I guess in a boring way, sort of where are you along that train? Do you at the end of this, do you submit it to a panel for review? And I can't remember, but I think you may not have said what school you're at, or if you did, I apologize, but I couldn't remember it when you said New York. I was curious where. So.
Oh, God. Yeah, I don't know if I said it. I'm at the School of Visual Arts Interaction Design program, so SVA IXT for short. And I'm nearing the end of it, so I need to present my thesis the first week of May. I don't remember the exact date. And final deliverable varies for each person. Some sort of prototype, so we are designing things, so you have to have it be done in some sense. That might mean sort of like a clickable prototype that doesn't actually work, which is totally fine. Or if you're able to, you can sort of try and get something out the door, which is what I'm trying to do. I have a CS background, so I'm able to do some web development, so I want to kind of take advantage of that. So for me, what I'm hoping for is that by May, I have something that is at least semi-finished, where I can sort of put it out into the world and broadcast it with a real URL and stuff like that. So that's what I'm shooting for.
Very cool.
And if I may ask, how did the connection from computer science to this come about?
So I was getting a CS degree at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and I did an internship as like a real software engineer and hated it. And I ended up becoming a PM, a program manager, which is this role that sort of sits in between the engineering work and the design work. And I kept sort of drifting closer and closer to design, but I didn't have the vocabulary. I couldn't really sort of talk the talk or do what a designer does. So I wanted to go back to school, and that's why I'm here, and what the future holds is very much unknown to me.
And do you think that computer science background and the mentality of that has helped you approach this project in maybe a different way than, say, someone who's coming at it from a political science background or a design background?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, we had talked about this in private earlier about your civil engineering background. And when you get an engineering degree, you think a lot about systems and how systems work and that sort of thing. So what I don't think I was thinking about it enough until I saw it change my view. And then I had like a realization. It's like, oh yeah, I need to start thinking about how you incentivize certain behavior. Like, how do you reward if someone does a good post? And so seeing a lot of those things on Change My View actually led to me really redesigning how the site worked even in the last month. And that's only going to continue more going forward.
Great, yeah.
Very cool. And so it sounds like then you've gone sort of from the computer science into a more creative field. So it's I guess it's an unusual combination really of creative and more scientific linear type stuff. Is it how is it managing both of those at once?
I think I'm not as creative as I would like to be, and I find being creative really hard sometimes. Like, I went from the world of one right answer to no right answers, and so that was hard. But that being said, like, there's all sorts of creativity, I think, in all engineering. I think it's a different type of creativity, but finding solutions to problems that don't exist yet requires a process of testing things that may or may not work, and a willingness to learn from them and iterate on them, which I think is very much in line with how the design process works. So I think designers are not magically creative people that just sort of wave their hands and come up with a solution. They're very methodical in the way that engineers are, of saying, here's what we think is going to work and why, and then we test it, and then we learn from it, and we keep going forward. So that part has translated really well.
Right on. Yeah.
Yep.
So can anyone access your kind of prototype at the moment, or was it just a private link you sent us?
Anyone can access it. I can read it out loud, and maybe I can send you a link for your show notes. I have to find it.
It's to the show notes right now.
What was that?
I'm adding it to the show notes right now.
Okay, cool. So it's what are they thinking? So watt-firebase.firebaseapp.com. So thank you, Google, for giving me free hosting privileges, and that's where I'm doing all my development. So yeah, anybody can try it out. A lot of the new thinking, like the rules thinking and systems thinking, hasn't been applied to this prototype yet, but hopefully in the coming weeks, that'll be there. But you can come and contribute a page, and there's sort of like these stubs for how you should write the page, which I think work kind of well. So yeah, if anyone listening to this wants to give it a whirl and send me an email, that would be fantastic.
And you've got some new features coming up
Awesome.
as well. Do you like kind of maybe a discussion on each page or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Exactly. So the two big things that I think I need to add are the ability to deliver positive feedback or rewards. So I think I'm going to implement something like Medium, where you can give highlights, but just like, and I don't know the rules as well as you guys know them, but whatever the rule is where you say you have to give a reason for your delta, I think you need to give a reason for your highlight. And then exactly as you said, there needs to be a discussion page on each page, so that you can work out, just like Wikipedia has talk pages, somewhere where you can work out some of these differences with people.
Cool. And then I thought it might be worth just underlining one more time what I think is, and just in my own words, one of this is that these descriptions are describing positions, but not things that they're anti. Like, it's just like, I have this position, but it's not talking about how the other side's wrong. It just describes a point of view, fairly represent a consensus of that view as we know it in culture today, but that without the part that where the time's wasted where the other side's just talking about the other side. You know,
exactly.
Is that about right?
Exactly. It's very much not a platform to win arguments. It's just a platform to explain how you see things and why you see things. Just like, I think rule 1 or rule A, whichever one is, say what you think and then say why you think it. It's the exact same idea.
And do you have a rule against filling in perspectives for other people, right? So you really want people to just focus on their own beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. So that rule's there. There's absolutely no system to enforce that rule other than me happening to catch it. But yeah, that's exactly the idea.
And I guess you might have some problems in the future trying to moderate that to prevent people, what's the word, astroturfing or something.
Yeah, I got to figure out. I mean, I think if I get to a place where people are trying to mess with the system and the posts, that's a great problem to have, because it means that it's reached people to the point of pissing them off so much that they want to mess with it. So I'll probably deal with that when I get there, but that's something that I'm thinking about a lot more now.
Great. So have you got any other links where maybe people can find you, or Twitter or
Twitter's definitely the best place to reach me. I'm at Son of Diesel, SONOF, diesel as in like diesel gasoline. Or they can email me or go to my thesis blog, which is medium.com/thesis-blog.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for speaking to us about your project. Yeah, it's been really interesting, and we wish you the very best with it going forward.
And thank you so much for having me on and answering all my questions. I've talked to both you and Michael now on a few separate occasions, and as I've said many times, this has been a tremendous help in my work. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating project and right in line with what we're doing too, and we're happy to give you to talk about it. So, but yeah, and just for the listeners' sake, Alex, I think is going to stick with us here on the couch, right, as we bring in our next person.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So just now we have an Opie who's posted to Change My View recently. Hello, Opie. Are you there?
Hey, I'm here. How's it going?
Hello, very well, thank you, and thank you for coming on. So your username on Reddit is neutrino_gambit, and is that how you would like us to refer to you today?
You can just call me Will. I think that will make everything a lot easier.
Okay, thank you, Will. So you've actually posted twice to Change My View recently, and the one that caught our eye that we wanted to bring you on for was something slightly unusual for the subreddit. As you would expect, we get a lot of political topics and very deep philosophical discussions, but this one was very interesting. The title, "There are only 4 viable answers to a yes or no question." Would you like to summarize this post and the view and maybe why you were interested in talking about it on the subreddit?
Yeah, sure thing. I guess a summary of the post is, as you said, the original idea was there are 4 answers to a yes or no question. The first 2 obviously being yes and no, with the third and fourth being I don't know, and that's logically inconsistent. The reason I kind of posted it was I've been having a lot of these sort of debates recently, and as you said, I posted a previous Change My View and had a lot of good responses from that. And one of the things I found was when you were looking at a kind of trying to get a pure logical train going through the entire thing, that you often kind of hit a wall where you try and get down to kind of yes or no questions to really understand people's views. And I found it very difficult at times when people weren't responding to questions that I believed, possibly falsely, were clear, simple questions that were yes or no, and I was getting paragraphs of answers, and at no point did I actually get a clear yes or no answer. So I kind of thought, well, maybe actually I'm wrong here. Maybe there are many answers to it. So I kind of put to the community, here's what I think. And I got just hundreds of replies, which honestly I expected 5. And I ended up having to write, I think, 120 replies to people, just some absolute nonsense like that. And it was incredible.
Can I just commend you for actually going through and doing 120 replies? Like we've had OPs that don't at all. And that's why we have the rule done there.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and that's interesting because in some ways that contradicts what I just said about it being non-political. Because as soon as you were saying that, my thoughts went to interviews of MPs or politicians on the TV where they're asked a simple question and they somehow manage to turn it into like you say, paragraphs of. It's almost like they're trying to derail the question and as if we don't notice. So this is relevant to politics, in fact. So just could you summarize maybe how people were able to criticize this view and some of the discussion you might have had?
Yeah, sure thing. There were, to be honest, there were kind of 3 different camps of kind of discussions that came out of it. The first 2 I kind of expected to come out as, the main one is you can't just get your point across with yes or no, as even if technically yes or no are the correct answer, they don't give all the information. And there's a lot of the time where people answer with yes or no, people just see yes and then just ignore the entire rest of the clarification, which really isn't helpful for discussion. The second camp was that even if yes or no are possible answers, things like sometimes, I think one of the great answers someone gave was, do you like fruit? Yes or no? I like bananas. I hate apples. What is the answer to that question? Is it yes? Is it no? That was kind of a really good one I found. And that one I really have had a lot of thought on. The third one was completely out of left field, which I wasn't expecting at all, which was actually, there are only 2 answers to yes or no question. Yes and no. And I'm not quite sure why I didn't think that was going to be coming, as the idea was that if you say I don't know, you haven't actually answered the question. And if you say it's logically inconsistent, well, then it wasn't really ever a yes or no question to begin with. And I think that was the first delta I gave. That was the one where I kind of thought, oh, you know, the others, there's a lot of merit to them, we'll have to think about. That one I went, oh, you're just right, I'm wrong. And like that was a really quick, oh, I've just made a mistake here.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I guess the question, someone might define the question as a yes or no. So someone poses a question to you, and they tell you it's a simple yes or no question, and you're supposed to just kind of take that as fact that it is a yes or no question, but it might not be true. They might have misnamed the question. So that second camp struck me as interesting there as well. I guess maybe that's where my thoughts led to this. So I'm interested in how there were so many comments that came out of what is, you would have thought perhaps was such a basic discussion, but I mean, this just shows, you know, Change My View really can be full of these discussions just come out of nowhere. Do you know why maybe it sprawled on so long?
I think kind of one of the main reasons is it was such a simple concept that, you know, you ask someone about something complicated, political, people have a lot of wide views, people have a lot of opinions. Something this simple, everyone immediately thinks, I know the answer to that. It's the sort of thing where you don't even think, you go, of course, I know the answer to that. There are 2 answers, there are 3 answers, there are 4 answers. I know. So soon everyone just kind of read it and then went, you know, I can pitch in on that. And also I find because it's essentially a question that underpins almost all other kinds of CMVs. It's the sort of thing where, you know, a lot of the time it's not a particular thing you're looking at. It's kind of the fundamental logic. And I find that's what's really good about the community, where it's sure people have different views, but people always want to try and actually have a proper conversation about it. And this sort of thing, this sort of logic can be applied to any conversation. It wasn't specific. Like you said earlier, it could be applied to politics, yes, but also it can be applied to, do you like fruit? It can be applied to kind of anything. It was vague enough that, you know, it can be applied loads of places, but it was also specific enough that everyone had their own opinion on it, which, to be honest, I found really good. I could not keep up with the replies I was getting, and I felt really bad. I ended up putting an edit saying, I've tried, I have failed to reply to you all. Sorry, I did my best.
Perhaps, do you think that some of them got into semantics a bit too far, or was it quite good quality throughout?
I'd say there were people, to be fair, who got into semantics too far, and those are the ones where I found when I had to start dropping conversations because I couldn't keep up. Those are the ones I started dropping, the ones where, to be honest, they weren't really adding any value. They were maybe technically correct. Maybe, you know, they were using language and they were actually trying to change my view of a particular word. And while they might have been right, you know, it didn't help. Like, even if my view was changed, it wouldn't actually change anything I do or the way I think. So, you know, maybe they were right, but it didn't really get anywhere. I tried to focus on kind of the ones that did. And there were a lot of them, to be fair, and they did overlap a lot. Like, there were a lot of people who gave the same answer, but there were a lot of people who didn't. A lot of people gave surprising answers, they were the ones I tried to focus on, because the ones, you know, if you think there's an answer coming through, you already have an answer ready for it. It's a much less interesting discussion than something completely from left field that you go, oh, wow, never considered that.
Yeah. And I think that's quite a common feeling throughout Change My View as well, is that people, they go in expecting things, and you know, it doesn't always turn out that way they might expect. So, and I find it really interesting that this post came out of a previous CMV that, like you mentioned there, I assumed they were completely unrelated, but so you actually reflected on your experience of Change My View and came out with this to some extent.
Yeah, pretty much. As it's the sort of thing I'd always had a bit in the back of my mind, but I never been able to formulate. And then in another one, I was having a conversation with someone, and now after this, I think I was in the wrong, where I just wanted them to say yes or no and then clarify to a question. And I was getting very frustrated, to be honest, as I asked the question over and over in as many forms as I could think of, as literally just, can you please answer this yes or no question? Why aren't you answering this? And like, I tried to be polite, but I just couldn't understand where they were even coming from. I'm not sure I necessarily agree still, but I at least now get where they were coming from, which I find is half the battle.
it's very interesting to me that you mentioned, Will, like right or wrong doesn't necessarily constitute a change of view, right? Like there are all sorts of these nuances as you're going through this conversation, that even if someone is right, it doesn't necessarily change your view, or even if someone is not right, it still might change their view. So it's amazing to me that those sorts of nuances come out in these sorts of conversations.
Yeah, I completely agree, as I have found from the kind of the favorite ones I've read through and that I've kind of had to think about, they are the ones where, my views changed. There are a lot of them where I read some of the top ones even, where I go through and go, well, it does kind of, apparently I was wrong about this, but it doesn't really change anything I do. Kind of, it's nice that things, have changed, but it really is helpful when, you actually have something changed that then goes on to affect anything else you do. Like, for instance, from this one, it will affect the way I deal with other things I post and other comments I go on. And that's why I really like that sort of discussion, because it's nice to have kind of theoretical things changed. But when you actually change something and it gets put into practice, that's kind of where you've actually benefited.
Yeah, and I think...
Hey, bro. Oh, go ahead. Alex, go ahead.
Sorry. I think, not, I guess I'm being selfish and bringing it back to me, but I think if there's one thing that I'm trying to do is prove that we can have better conversations, even if we continue to disagree with people. You now will have much greater insight into how people conduct those conversations and what perspectives that people have. So going forward, just like you said, like this is now going to change how you conduct yourself in the future with other people, right?
Oh, yes, 100%.
Yeah, and that's also reminds me of a similar reflection someone else had recently in the subreddit with regard to how they were approaching discussions. And it was this idea of, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but fisking, which is a method of replying point by point. It's a slang word named after a British journalist called Robert Fisk. And this had never occurred to me until it was brought up in the subreddit. And so apparently some people really don't like being fisked, in other words, because basically it feels like they get into semantics point by point. They're not actually having a conversation. They're not speaking to each other. You get down the rabbit hole. And I'm not actually sure if Robert Fisk was someone who did this or had it done to him. But anyway, they've taken his name. So, but yeah, no, and we had a blog post on that as well. So yeah, it's interesting, these reflections.
I had just a couple of quick questions. So first off, just as a 20-foot dinosaur, do you use a normal human-sized keyboard, or do you have like a special?
Is why I currently, you can tell I don't have a webcam. I can't fit on it. Like, that's the reason why. Yeah, I mean, I think I hope at least everyone can kind of know from reading kind of what I wrote there. I was trying to be absurd. That wasn't a real point, but yeah. Yeah,
you wanted to create a hypothetical, of course.
Yeah, which
what I was wondering is I was just wondering, when I first read your post, the one thing that first popped in my mind, I don't feel like I've seen anywhere yet, which is a quote I remember from the West Wing addressing the question. A potential response to a yes or no question is, I don't grant the premise. Would you count that as a subcategory of logically inconsistent, or something different? Because to me, that would be like the third answer I could think of in addition to yes or no.
So by I don't grant the premise, is that the sort of thing where your question is already inferring information? It's things such as, have you stopped beating your wife, which is inferring that you already were. Okay. To be honest, that one there is kind of when we've been in the gray area, as I very much hold. I'll take the question, have you stopped beating your wife? I hold the answer to that is no, as in you haven't stopped. No, and then clarify, I haven't stopped doing this because I never started. That was where a lot of people are coming from, where I still hold the answer to that question is no, but that question is clearly a loaded question and has no place in a reasonable debate. But you have to be very sure that the person you're actually talking to is very willing to not try and take things out of context. My kind of answer to that was, if you're, you're a politician on a political thing, sure, don't actually answer the question, say, like, don't necessarily give yes or no. But if you are actually, trying to have a proper debate with someone who you believe is arguing in good faith, debating in good faith, and they ask that sort of question, they're probably not. So maybe reevaluate why you're having the conversation.
Right. Okay. So then what you're changing my view would really apply to it would apply to a set of ideal type all conversations.
Sorry, you went a bit hazy there. Can you say that again?
Sure. Yeah. I was saying what your post applies to when you say there's only 4 answers to a yes or no question is a set that apply to that a specific set of idealized types of conversations that you would hope people would attend to.
The internet problems we mentioned earlier on are coming into play again.
All right. I think I got the gist of it though. So it was what you were saying that, does my CMV apply to all conversations or just a subset?
Yeah.
And pretty much, I think ideally it should apply to all of them. As if you're having a kind of a proper debate with someone where you both feel like you're debating in good faith, then definitely applies. I kind of feel if you're, say, having a political debate or something like that, where actually your goal isn't an exchange of ideas and your goal is to convince people of a certain view, at that point, are you really going to be answering to the best of your ability, or are you just going to try and get your view across? I feel they're kind of slightly separate things. As, say, someone asks you on a political show, do you support war or something like that? You're not going to say yes or no, because it's not going to get your message across. So at that point, you are going to not answer the question. And I'm actually okay with you not answering the question. But what I'm not okay with is you saying you've answered the question when you haven't.
So if I said to that question, well, it depends on the circumstances, would that satisfy you as an answer?
That's kind of where the sometimes camp comes in, essentially. And that is where I actually think is the second bit that kind of changed my view. I think there are things where it is sometimes it's not yes or no. As, say, do you like fruit, for instance? My answer would be yes, I like fruit, but I hate apples because I like most fruit. But if I like exactly half of fruit, or I liked almost half of fruit, saying yes or no, it's not really a fair answer. And I think you do need to say sometimes. So yeah, I agree with you there. I do think that you need to add another category of, I really can't answer that question because it depends so much on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in some ways, this ties back to the conversation we were having with Alex earlier on about ideologies, because if you were to try and define yourself as some kind of political ideology, you might not agree with every part of it, but on the whole, you take the ones maybe you agree with the most and declare yourself that thing, which it gets kind of funny sometimes when maybe you feel like you've not aligned with the party on some issue, and it's a real like identity crisis for some people. This thing, like they tried to hold on to every aspect all at once.
And that's where like the cognitive dissonance comes in, right? Because you need to decide in that moment to say, like, am I going to go against the party trend, or am I going to fall in line and find a reason to fall in line? Like in Haidt's book, he talks about your elephant is essentially driving you towards an acceptable answer for yourself, in the same way that a press secretary for a president does. Like Sarah Sanders will, in 99% of cases, find out a way to sort of frame up that answer to that question to satisfy everybody. If that makes any sense.
That poor woman.
But she's good. I mean, the reason, like, whatever you think about her, she's good at her job. She is able to quell complete insanity in the White House. She finds a way to give everybody a good enough answer to get to the next question, which is something that Sean Spicer was unable to do. He couldn't wrestle with some of those questions, and she finds a way.
I wish like Thomas Kuhn were alive to watch her work and just like see him analyzing her creating paradigms on the fly to incorporate like essentially randomly generated data out of the Oval Office into some coherent paradigm. It's there's a certain genius that she can do that.
She might be a genius in her own special way. She is quite capable.
Yeah, I find people can do that. Like a lot of the time, I may not like them, but I have a huge amount of just respect for the ability to do that. Like, I'm not saying you're using it for good, but it's very impressive to be able to, on the fly, just mold arguments in a way that it looks like you've been saying the same thing all along, and now people are actually seeing it's right, when in fact, what you've somehow done is you've taken something that you said something slightly different, and pretended they're the same. It's an incredible skill.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if liking all fruit was somehow necessary to your party, you might try and make more excuses for the apples. Whereas because because you don't really care about whether you're seen to like apples or not. You can make those distinctions within that general question. That's
why Big Apple is giving them names you can't criticize, like Granny Smith. You know, you can't make fun of them. We're all living under the Big Apple's, reign of terror.
So, I would be tempted to go into the topic and the discussion that inspired all of this, Will. But to be honest, I quite like the theme of this episode. It's nice and kind of aligned, and I wonder now if going into it would be too random at the end. What do you think, Michael?
I'm super tempted to go down the Jordan Peterson rabbit hole because I'm a fan of his and would be interested in all the connections there. But yeah, I think in terms of all hanging together as a topic for the episode, we've done pretty neat and nice as far as the meta of this episode. So we'd always get into it another time, perhaps. But yeah. Yeah,
I mean, if we have a episode that relates to your other post, Will, perhaps we'll get you on. But yeah, I agree. I think maybe we should wrap this up here, just because it's been so nice and yeah, there's been a thread throughout. So if anyone's got any final thoughts, perhaps now's the time to say them. Otherwise, maybe
yeah, I've just got one quick share. I wanted to do one of our fun posts for the week.
Okay. Yep.
And then we'll hopefully try and make this quick. One of the 2 fun posts I picked, one was the 4 ways to answer a question, which I actually thought was super cool. And you'd pulled it up independently for different reasons. So that was kind of a cool coincidence. But the other one, and this is a nice classic one here, but it also gets a little heavy into real world, sort of. And the fun one for this week is submitted by user BRACS279, Brax279. Change my view. Magneto is right. Humans cannot coexist with mutants. So I'll just do a quick rundown of the OP's summary and then see if anyone has any comments on it as our last little segment here. So OP says, for reference, I'm talking about the Marvel mutants. I'm aware of the multiple universes and retcons, but to keep it simple, I'm going to focus on the latest Fox movies. From the Xavier School, this point 1, we can see that most mutants develop power while being teens, not exactly the most rational group of people. While we can't have human teenagers at school, what if a bullied mutant decides to kill a whole class? What if they get detention? What if they get rejected by a love interest? This interest alone would make any school shooting seem like a picnic. Number 2, besides, we can't really expect human teachers to guide them in controlling their powers. Hell, even Xavier has troubles here. This means the mutants would grow up among themselves, and socializing with humans later in life would be even more difficult. 3, we can't have a democracy where mind control is a thing. All a mutant needs to do is control human leaders, and we can, and we the people will never be able to tell. Number 4, we can't have a justice system where all defendants go free after they declare I was being mind controlled. It was Mystique that was looking like me, etc. The only alternative would be to suppress the presumption of innocence, and that would be unthinkable. Point 5, we can't have peace and the rule of law where some people wield extremely dangerous powers. This is not even like carrying guns, but some mutants have firepower more than tanks or fighter jets. Unlike racism, we humans can have very good reasons to fear an angry mutant. Number 6 and last point, we won't be able to police the mutants. Even if we have mutant police officers as well, there are just too many of them and with powers and varieties of powers that no police force will ever adapt to. The only way I can think of this final summation, the only way I can think of to keep humanity safe is to monitor kids since birth, that the first signs they would either signs of their superpowers, they would either be euthanized on the spot or deported to mutant-only territories.
Well,
I don't know what happened to this person in their life before this, but
I'm just so thankful that your internet didn't cut out during that. We just got
that was
clear run through.
Oh wow, okay, yeah. Point. That is actually a miraculous superpower, and it might have to be put down.
I think the first question I have is what about factions that would inevitably develop within mutants? Like, what if it's the mind control that sets mutants apart from everybody else? Then anyone who doesn't have mind control, they are not a good enough mutant. And then what happens to those people? I think it gets messy very quickly.
Oh, you're bringing your research to bear here.
I like X-Men.
That's awesome. Yeah.
There's also a really interesting kind of fundamental assumption here that it's a bad thing if humanity is essentially eradicated, which, as a human, I think it would be. But throughout kind of all of history, there were Neanderthals, they're gone because we were better. And you'd have that consistently throughout the entire thing. it's an interesting one to draw the line right here and go, no, we are the ones who evolution shouldn't put to the side. And while, you know, as a human, I think that would be great. I think it's definitely something that should be discussed about whether, you know, mutants are just, they are just better. They are kind of objectively better. Maybe that's not that bad a thing for mutants just to take over because, you know, they're better.
You're asking the real questions here, you know? I mean, there's eventually there'll be some kind of homeostasis reached. I think outside of existential threats or like the, you know, inclusion of like the living tribunal or something like that, it feels manageable, but the mental powers thing, I don't know. I think some of that stuff you could just legislate, like just like anyone can in the U.S. can for most people could acquire a gun. Most people don't end up shooting people. I think, you know, the vast majority of people who end up being like normal, decent people, that rule probably would apply across mutants. And to me, it seems like it could be self-regulatory. With mutant police, I think would pretty much cover it. From my point of view, I think we'd figure it out, you know?
Yeah, I guess my big concern in general would be it's not, you know, your average mutant. It's not kind of your run-of-the-mill ones that are the problem. Most of them will be fine. It's the random extremes of, you know, say someone is born who has a power to blow up the Earth. Is it, I guess, if we're talking about the Fox ones, that's quite a leap. If you talk about the comic ones, it's not. As in...
Oh, there's dozens of them, yeah.
Yeah, there's tons of them. And, you know, the odds of just, you know, in 100 years, one of them being born and one of the ones who are born not having control of their powers, it's a terrifying concept.
Boy, I guess, yeah, but like to euthanize them though, it's, I mean, does it do more damage to us as a species if we allow ourselves to do that to 10-year-olds, you know? Or is there some like homogenized, sanitized way to do it, like in the first week of pregnancy or something, where it's just less traumatizing to everyone involved? Or if we are dealing with truly existential threats being born every year, you know?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the Logan film approach of they just kind of put something in the crops that killed the X gene or whatever it was, you know, it doesn't sit right with me, but, you know, it might be the best of a bunch of horrible options.
Yeah, like you could prevent future mutants from coming around, then you kind of just deal with the ones you got until they grow old of old age, except for Wolverine.
Yeah, who will be a problem forever, or a solution forever.
Well, I don't know. It might be a good note to go out on, unless anyone else has got something.
I'm good.
I've got nothing. I'm good.
All right. Well, Cal, you want to sign us out?
Yeah. So thank you to both of our guests, Alex and Will, for joining us today. It's been really interesting, and thanks to whoever's listening just now for bearing with us through our technical glitches and general evolution of the podcast as we try and figure the best way out. So thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Good night.